Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the summit. This is going to be a fascinating discussion, I'm sure. I'm not going to bother with huge, long introductions, owing to the fact that you wouldn't all be here unless you knew that General Cynic Carter is the Chief of the Defence Staff, and General David Petraeus has commanded ISAF in Iraq and was in charge of the forces in Afghanistan. So this is really as good as it gets when it comes to senior and successful generals. And I'm going to start by asking you just how you met.
Well, first of all, thanks, Andrew. Congratulations on the third year of a great gathering. I am holding your book.
Oh yes, so you are. So you are, General.
This is the one. This is the one after the biography of Churchill, which was equally brilliant, and
that's very
which
kind.
I did.
These two gentlemen don't have books to sell. I, on the other hand,
I did interview him in New York on that and had great fun. Look, we got to know each other when Nick was a 2-star general. I was a 4-star. I was the commander of U.S. Central Command, which was, as we saw it, 90% of the world's problems at the time, from Egypt in the west to Pakistan in the east, Kazakhstan in the north to Yemen and the pirate-infested waters off Somalia to the south. Afghanistan was one of the two major war theaters. Iraq was the other. Nick was a division commander, and what was really curious was that he was commanding more Americans than I think any British general since Montgomery, and maybe including Montgomery. I think it ultimately reached something like 45,000 before we split those commands off. Now, later, subsequent year, I came back. Nick was still in command, had done a brilliant job implementing the new strategy, and I took command in Afghanistan and had the pleasure of having him there for 3 more months. I was keen to see him come back as the deputy, which in fact he did do, but after I left, after I went to the CIA, and I followed him when he was the DCOM there as well, and then obviously ever since as the Army Chief and now the Chief of Defense Staff.
And Cynic, what do you remember of working with David?
Well, if ever you wanted a quality that's relevant to leadership in war, it's a personal quality, and David has that in spades. The first visit he made to me, my son was struggling with finding a job. He just graduated from university just after 2008. And David gave me some very good advice and told him the one thing that my young son should do is to read The Big Short. Anyway, I thought that's a great piece of advice, and I never didn't think any more of it. But when he then came back as Commander ISAF about 3 or 4 months later, after General McChrystal had been moved on, he came straight down to see me because we were on the sort of main effort of his campaign. And the first thing he did was to walk into my office and hand over a copy of The Big Short, in which he had written to young Edward words to that effect, "You should be really proud of what your old dad's doing." And if ever there was a sort of personal touch which gets your subordinates to support you, that was absolutely it. Thank you.
And in the when it comes to the military side, you were implementing the counterinsurgency strategy that David put into place before the surge. Tell us about that.
Yes, it was essentially a population-centric approach. Now, it absolutely depended upon providing security to the population. And of course, it was about trying to then connect governance to the population. Whereas I think hitherto a lot of people had thought it was all about focusing on the enemy. And of course, insurgency is essentially a political problem, and the key to it is about working out what the causes of it are and about the politics surrounding it. And that was the inspired approach that David adopted in Iraq, which we began to deal with in Afghanistan. And it began to have a significant impact in parts of Afghanistan, and certainly in Kandahar, where I was serving at the time.
And keep in mind that Kandahar, where Nick was at the time, this was Mullah Omar, is the founder of the Taliban. This is his home turf. So this is one of the reasons why this is the main effort, to push back, because the situation had been eroding for quite some time, especially in the south and the southwest. And so the importance of what he was doing was very, very significant, and it was the main effort for the entire force. So again, it was a curious situation where you had a Brit in charge of all these Americans, certainly a sizable British contingent as well, and doing it absolutely brilliantly.
And did you feel that gave you insights into the working nature of the special relationship?
Yeah, very much so. You know, look, I was totaled up the other day. I think I had something like 7 or 8 British deputies, because I was not only a U.S. commander as a 3-star and 4-star in some of these different assignments, I was also a NATO commander. So every time you had a NATO commander, you had the DCOM was always British, because the Brits were the very much the number 2 contingent in all these different organizations. And every time I would fly back and forth to Iraq or to the Middle East or to later on to Afghanistan, I would stop in London, either going out or coming back, depending on whether or not I thought it would be useful to convey what was in Washington, or if I wanted to see what was in London before I went to Washington, and would go over to number 10 and Whitehall and all that. And again, that was the special relationship. It is still, I believe, the special relationship. And it's more than just military, of course. It's also the intelligence services, it's the diplomatic corps, it's the development community. And at the end of the day, it's the values and shared heritage and future, I would hope, as well.
Do you feel the same way, sir?
Yes, undoubtedly. I mean, I think that our military-to-military relationship has never been stronger. And that's probably as a result of the wars we've been fighting together over the last 20 years and still indeed continue to fight them together. And we have British deputies plugged into 3 of the US divisions now in our army. Our aircraft carrier, which is going to be fielded next year and do its sort of first proper deployment, half of its aircraft will be from the US Marine Corps. Now, there are not many nations who have got that level of interoperability and that extraordinary ability to fight together.
And let's talk about that, the ability to fight future wars. Can you give us an overview of what a future war might look like? We've seen that drone attack on the Aramco oil facilities in Saudi Arabia. We've seen lots of talk about wars in space and cyber wars and so on. Can you just sum up for us what you think the parameters might be like?
Well, I think unlike the past when we used to frame warfare through air, land and sea, now you will frame it through 5 domains because you will add space and cyber to air, maritime and to land. And of course the key bit that will give you the edge you need is the way in which information connects them together so that you are properly integrated at every level. And information is going to be the core of so much of what we do because so much of it essentially is about the triumph of the narrative these days. And it's about the effect you have on a much broader population than just simply the enemy. So future warfare is going to be very much information-centric. Technology is going to be at the heart of it. There will still clearly be human interaction, because essentially it's a political function warfare, but it will be much more sophisticated in those other 2 domains of space and cyber, and how you integrate those.
And what are your plans as CDS to be able to integrate those? Are you getting the support you need? What's the job like? What keeps you awake at night?
So he's in government still. I can speak in this sense, and then I'll let him go back to the end. There's never been a general in history who had enough troops,
enough money, exactly.
enough bandwidth nowadays, enough drones as well.
Yeah.
So you don't need to answer the first part of the question.
Okay, ignoring the first part of the question, what are your priorities as CDS?
Well, first and foremost, it's about measuring up to the threats of today. And of course, Russia is much more of a threat to us than it was 5 years ago. And terrorism continues to be there. And then second, it's really getting the armed forces to be prepared for the modernisation that is going to have to occur. And the challenge you always have in a job like this is getting the right balance between the fight today and the fight tomorrow, because inevitably you get fixed by what's happening today. So trying to find the headroom to modernise, when modernisation is going to be about technology. And of course the pace of technological development is so rapid at the moment, that means that you've got to have a really good look at the way you procure things these days. You know, the stately dance of setting a requirement and expecting something to arrive in 15 to 20 years' time just won't cut the mustard in the future. So the relationship you have with industry, the way you procure stuff, how you can achieve the pace of reform that's necessary to place you in the right position for, 10 to 15 years' time, is my biggest challenge.
You mentioned Putin and Russia and cyber, of course. And it's widely felt that a few years back Russia did attack Estonia in a cyber attack. I mean, you were director of the...
Shut down. You know, it's Estonia, by the way. Truly, I mean, this is the most connected government in the world. In fact, I go there every year. There's a cyber center of excellence there, and I'm on their board. And e-governance in the most connected country in the world was shut down by a massive denial of service attack by Russia, without question. And they learned some hard lessons out of that, to put it mildly. But that was just one of many actions taken, of course, by Russia to either literally invade its neighbors, Georgia and Ukraine, or to intimidate others, the Baltic states, or to mischief with NATO aircraft over the Baltics, or all of these. I mean, there's a reason why, look, Vladimir Putin is the greatest gift to NATO since the end of the Cold War, without question.
Would you agree with that?
He's in
Yes,
government.
I mean, at the end of the day, NATO's centre of gravity is about political cohesion, and if you've got a threat that can cohere NATO,
Yeah.
so much the better. But of course, it's not as simple as that. I mean, NATO has got some serious political challenges at the moment in its 70th year. First and foremost, there are issues about how Turkey fits into it at the moment, for reasons people will have read about. And then, of course, the threat depends upon where you sit. And there's definitely those who are nearer Russia who worry about it more than those who are further away from Russia. So there are challenges in the political cohesion. But I do absolutely agree with David. Putin has been very helpful to getting us to make the case for why we need to modernise.
And now we've talked about Russia, let's move on to China, because that obviously long-term is a major threat, is it not?
Well, look, the rise of China is the single biggest development geopolitically in this century and may well continue throughout the century to be so. And I would contend that this very interesting relationship between the U.S. and China in particular, the reigning superpower and the aspiring superpower, is the most important of relationships in the world by far, bar none. And it's unlike the geostrategic competition that existed when you had the US-led West against the Soviet-led East, because in this case, we're not only each other's biggest strategic competitors, we're also each other's biggest trading partners, or at least we were until the tariffs started being imposed. So this is a situation in which we have to figure out a way to go forward, or else not only our countries, but the entire world will have a penalty because of that. And we've also got to get through this and come to some kind of modus operandi between our countries so that each side understands very, very clearly what the national interests of the other are, what the vital interests are, and how we, again, can coexist. Right now, I think it's accurate to say that we're in the early stages of what might be termed a technology Cold War. You're already seeing a fracturing. I mean, you no longer have the World Wide Web. Let's recognize that there are 1.3 billion people who are behind the Great Firewall of China and do not have access to the World Wide Web anymore, and it's getting tougher and tougher to get out on a VPN. You're seeing supply chain concerns where one side won't buy chips that are made in the other side and won't sell them in the operating systems, all of this. And we're still sorting all of this out very clearly. It's all part of the overall trade competition and, again, the imposition of tariffs and so forth. But what I hope doesn't happen, because I'm one who very fervently wants to see this relationship be mutually beneficial, and truth in lending, I am now a partner in one of the world's biggest investment firms, and we are the biggest investor of our type in China. By the way, also India, Japan, and a number of other places. So we want to see this work out. But right now, it is beginning to fracture, and what we don't want to see is a true, full-on, all-out Cold War, reminiscent of what we experienced back in the days when we were all deployed in NATO Europe, faced off across the Iron Curtain or the inner German border with a very substantial force in a fairly hair-trigger situation. And keep in mind that now, in a world of artificial intelligence, machine learning, robotics, unmanned systems, and all the rest of this, you can see the day approaching where it's going to become increasingly difficult to keep the man in the loop. I mean, right now what we say, okay, the system has identified it, visual recognition or facial recognition is verified, this is the target or what have you, the person can still be in the loop. What happens when it's machines and the algorithms are functioning very rapidly and whoever shoots first wins, and you still want to keep the man in the loop? Well, of course you do for moral reasons, you certainly do, ethical reasons, but the pressure is going to become increasingly great as this evolves and as we end up with machines fighting machines, not just, by the way, on land, sea, and air, but also in cyberspace and then perhaps in outer space as well, as Nick mentioned earlier. It's all of these domains simultaneously in which you will be combating an adversary. And in some of these domains right now, very much the attacks are going on. I mean, just ask those who are under the assault of various cyber offensive actions, not just by nation states, but also by criminal entities that are ever more diabolically clever. If you aggregated all of what criminal entities are stealing every year in cyberspace, it would be a top 10 economy of the world. It's in trillions now, not just hundreds of billions. And then, of course, you also have non-state actors, some of which are extremists, who have exploited cyberspace very effectively as well. I mean, if you think about the Islamic State, what distinguished it probably more than anything else, except for the establishment of the caliphate, was how effective they were using social media and various other tools of the internet.
Well, having completely terrified us,
But that was part of the mission.
absolutely.
To sell your books.
A noble mission, David. What would you like to comment on some of those ideas thrown up, starting with China, going through the, specific perhaps, whether Huawei should be helping with the 5G network, for example? Is that something that the CDS gets involved in, or is that just left to politicians?
No, I tend to characterize the threat today as Russia being the acute threat and China being the chronic challenge. And I use those words advisedly because I think if you're a medium-sized power, not a superpower, you perhaps look at China in a slightly different way. Now, we absolutely recognize that a lot of what China is doing to us, whether it's the theft of intellectual property rights, et cetera, is a challenge and is obviously the way a threat might behave. But I think we recognize that we've got to find an accommodation with China. China is going to be a feature of this century, and we have to work out what that might be. I think we also recognise that the rules-based international system, which our countries espoused from 1945 onwards and which has assured our prosperity and security and stability since then, is threatened by China and China's interpretation of those rules, as indeed Russia's. And we've got to find a way of making that work, because to David's point about the way the character of warfare is evolving, and the way in which a whole load of very sophisticated technologies now are beginning to question the ethical and legal basis on which we apply the law of armed conflict. I think there's a debate that we need to have in the public space about what does the future of warfare look like when you end up with a combination of manned, unmanned, and autonomous technologies fighting that war for you, because we may not have the same control over some of this stuff as we've had in the past. And I think we already see that when the character of warfare has exposed the distinctions that don't exist any longer between peace and war. And personally, in my working life, I feel that I am now at war. I'm just not at war in the way that we would have defined it in the past. And that is because the great power competition and the battle by non-state actors is threatening us on a daily basis. And we have to find a way of managing that and winning that particular competition.
Your mention of law is very interesting because the think tank Policy Exchange has put out some interesting things about the way that lawfare, as it's called, can complicate your life. Is it a worry for you?
Yes, I think it's been a particular worry for our armed forces because we used to talk of the phenomenon of the Oxford coroner. Every time somebody was killed in Afghanistan, there was generally a coroner's investigation. And the coroner had a reasonable right to opine on the extent to which that casualty was killed in the way that it was killed, or he or she was killed. And actually that puts the commander on the ground in a very interesting place. When you then put on the back of that the sort of sense of vexatious claims that pursue some of the incidents that occur on modern battlefields, and a lot of that is to do with the European Court of Human Rights and so on and so forth, what we wouldn't want to see are our commanders at the lower levels, particularly on a battlefield of the future, feeling constrained by the possibility of being investigated for something. Because, of course, whilst the character of warfare changes, the nature of war doesn't change. Battlefields will always be full of friction, and you do need to give people the autonomy to be able to make decisions, to seize those fleeting opportunities that might help you win on that battlefield. So we do worry about the impact of law on the battlefield, but we also recognise that you have to retain the moral high ground. And that is why it's entirely appropriate if people definitely do things that are wrong on that battlefield, that they should be held to account for it.
What have we learned since 9/11 with regard to the Islamic terrorist threat? David mentioned that this was one of the non-state actors that is, and you obviously have supported that. What are the lessons?
I think there are 5 of the wars of the post-9/11 period in which we spent a fair amount of years fighting, frankly. The first is that ungoverned spaces in the Muslim world will be exploited by Islamist extremists. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when and how bad will it be. Second is that because Las Vegas rules do not apply in these places, what happens there doesn't stay there. It tends to spew violence, extremism, instability, and a tsunami of refugees, not least into Europe, where you see this is the proximate cause for much of the populism that you see in various EU countries. Because of that, rule number 2, or lesson number 2, is you actually have to do something about it. You do have to take action. You cannot, as we used to say, analysis or paralysis by analysis is what was occasionally accused. Number 3 is that generally, whether you like it or not, the U.S. generally has to lead because of the extraordinary capabilities that we can bring to bear. Keep in mind that the U.S. is now spending on defense much more than twice as much as all of our other 28 NATO countries put together, more than China and the next 10 or 11 or 12 countries. So the enormous gap between what the U.S. can bring to bear, especially when it comes to this constellation of drones, to precision munitions, and to the fusion of intelligence, means that the U.S. almost has to be engaged in some way. You may get a situation where another country leads, and that is to be encouraged if it's important, but you're still going to see the U.S. Involved, say in Mali, where the French took the lead. Having said that, you want allies. I am a huge believer in partnerships. I'm a huge believer in multilateral organizations for all of the challenges of coalition maintenance. And Churchill had it right, when he used to say that the only thing worse than fighting with allies is fighting without them. I should plug his great biography of Churchill again. So you want to have allies, and by the way, you especially want to have Muslim countries. This is a clash within that civilization, more than it is a clash of civilizations, as Sam Huntington wrote some years ago. Number 4 is a real paradox, and that is that you have to understand that you cannot counter terrorists with just counter-terrorist force operations. It's not enough just to do Delta Force raids and 2-2 SAS and drone strikes. Those are all important. They will need to be employed, but they have to be employed as part of a larger, comprehensive civil military counterinsurgency campaign, such as Nick and I were privileged to lead in Iraq and Afghanistan. And then finally, and this is a very difficult one, but we have to understand, I think, that this is the fight of a generation, not the fight of a decade, much less a few years. And you have to have a sustained commitment. But I recognize clearly that in a democracy, you can only sustain a commitment if it is sustainable in terms of blood and treasure. And this is where I think it's very important to recognize what we have figured out how to do now, where we're not the ones having to bear all the burden on the battlefields, but rather we are enabling host nation partners. We are advising, assisting, training, equipping, and again, enabling with these different capabilities. But they're the ones doing the fighting on the front lines. We saw this with the Iraqi security forces once they were able to recover from being shattered initially by the Islamic State, and then we helped them with their counteroffensive, eventually eliminated the caliphate in Iraq. We've done the same thing in Syria. We're doing the same thing to a considerable degree in Afghanistan, though I recognize that situation has deteriorated.
We'll come on to that in a
But so those, I think, are the 5 lessons. Again, these aren't comfortable. They're especially not comfortable or welcome if you recognize that we really need to be shifting our main effort from that of, again, fighting the wars of today to preparing for the potential wars of the future so that we can actually deter them. And again, that means the resurgence of great power rivalries. It's not just Russia, it's obviously China, and there's some other states in there as well. So we have to regain that capability, which would be, if it ever came, God help us, but it would be full on in every one of these domains simultaneously. And that's very, very different from what it was that we've been doing and must continue to do on the current battlefields against Islamist extremists.
So 5 domains there. Have you got any comments on any of them?
Well, I think the question you ask about what are the lessons, in a sense, since post 9/11, the big lesson for me, I think, is that it was Al-Qaeda to begin with, it became Daesh, and there will be other waves that follow from that, is that this is not about military action. This is about defeating an idea and understanding why that idea is such a challenge for us at the moment. And that is predominantly about people feeling excluded, a lack of education, a lack of opportunity. And what we have to do as a society, which the military are clearly a part of, is to get after that idea. And that's obviously going to be more likely to be Muslim-led. But it's also about us providing the opportunities for people to prosper, and therefore don't feel that they need to take on the sort of Islamic jihad that is currently underway. And I think we should all realise that we're a very, very long way from dealing with that. I mean, people talked rather too early, I think, about defeating the phenomenon that was Daesh in Syria and Iraq. The answer is we might have defeated the geography of it, but be in no doubt it is now recalibrating itself, and it is now an insurgency which will make life in Iraq and Syria extremely difficult for many years to come. And of course it has spread that phenomenon more broadly across the world. We now have ISIS in West Africa, we have ISIS in South Africa, we'll have ISIS in East Africa quite soon. We have it in China, we have it in the Philippines.
Afghanistan.
And of course in Afghanistan.
Which is the next question. What do you feel about the attempts to come to an accommodation with the Taliban? David first.
Well, I wrote about that actually, and I expressed some considerable concerns, misgivings, if you will. It's curious that if you could not get an agreement, when I was actually privileged to command the coalition in Afghanistan, we had 150,000 men and women in uniform from the coalition, plus hundreds of thousands of Afghans. And Richard Holbrooke, an extraordinary diplomat, the bulldozer we affectionately called him, and we couldn't get any real traction on meaningful negotiations with the Taliban. And I don't know if you can't get an agreement at a time like that, how do you get an agreement when the enemy senses that you want to leave, you have said you want to leave, and they're just trying to facilitate you leaving.
The art of the deal, don't you, David? Would you like to say anything about his attempt to, supposed attempt to bring the Taliban to Camp David?
Well, again, the symbolism of that, I think, would have been somewhat difficult, given that it was right around 9/11, and given that it was at Camp David that the decision was made in the wake of 9/11 to conduct what turned out to be the invasion or the elimination of al-Qaeda's sanctuary from Afghanistan, the sanctuary in which the 9/11 attacks were planned. So in the end, I applauded, if you will, his decision not to proceed with these discussions further. Look, I recognize, again, and I always love it that people, they say, well, there's no military solution to this problem. True statement. Again, as we've said earlier, you have to have a civil military, comprehensive. And I often say there's also no purely diplomatic solution to this problem either. It has to be all of the above. Look, we went to Afghanistan for a reason. That's where the 9/11 attacks were planned. That's where the initial training of the attackers was conducted in an al-Qaeda sanctuary when the Taliban controlled the bulk of the country, including that part. The idea that you could walk away and that they would not reestablish that, I think, is just very misplaced. They continue to try to establish that sanctuary again. The Islamic State now is also in that area. And there's something very special about Eastern Afghanistan to these groups. It's lost on me. I've been out there, I have stood, I have looked, I've said, what is it about? I mean, it's not Cliveden, I can tell you. The green hills of England, it is not. But they are intent on doing that. And again, I think the answer is to figure out how do you actually have a sustained commitment, noting that it has been very difficult on the battlefield for our Afghan partners and for some of the coalition forces as well.
So Nick, accommodation with the Taliban, question mark?
Well, I think you have to have a conversation. There's no question about that. And,
give it a shot.
Jonathan Powell, who of course was instrumental in making the Good Friday Agreement happen, always said it may not be the right time to negotiate, but it's always the right time to talk. So you've got to be talking. And I think the challenge that the negotiators had on this occasion was that in order to bring the Taliban to the table, they had to be offered something. And it was a question of what that offer looked like. And I suspect that during the course of this, the offer raised Taliban expectations to a level that would have been inappropriate in trying to achieve a lasting peace in Afghanistan. So it was absolutely right for there to be a recalibration. But what we now have to have is a process where the Afghan election occurs. It started yesterday. I don't think it'll be definitive until perhaps Christmas time, so that we then have a legitimate Afghan government, which ultimately can be the mechanism through which you end up re-engineering that conversation. It's also absolutely important that we recognise that this is not just an Afghan problem, it's a regional problem as well. And the role that all of us have to play in trying to make sure that some form of accommodation is reached between Afghanistan and Pakistan is critical, but also how the other actors play into this. And we should be in no doubt that Iran is looking eastwards as well as westwards. And the role that Iran is playing in making mischief in Afghanistan is one that's unhelpful. And we need to work out how we play that into this equation. So I'm absolutely with David, but I also firmly believe that we've got to have a conversation. Mm-hmm. Now, I got into a lot of trouble on this, I'll tell you, trying to amuse the audience. Because when I was the deputy commander in 2013, David Cameron came to visit Afghanistan. This is very much about having a photo opportunity before the boys pulled out of helmet. And the day before, I had obviously slightly inadvisedly given an interview to a journalist in The Guardian in which I'd said we should be talking to the Taliban. And this became the headlines of the world's newspapers on the very day that David Cameron arrived in Helmand. So there was absolutely no speaks between me and him during the course of the next 4 hours. And we then ended up in Karzai's court at the end of the visit for the sort of routine presentations. And the Afghan contingent line of people was introduced first. And then the British line. And President Karzai came to me and he kissed me 5 times on both cheeks. And he put his arms around me. And he turned to David Cameron. He said, "This general must be promoted." he has said what every general should have said since 2004. And David Cameron beamed. And I was let off.
Let's remember, we did do reconciliation in Iraq. And so this can be done. The challenge when it comes to Afghanistan, and I remember one time on the way home from my 3-star tour in Iraq, Secretary Rumsfeld asked me to go through Afghanistan, which I pointed out was not the direct route back, but anyway. And I came back and gave him an analysis, and the very first slide was titled, "Afghanistan does not equal Iraq," and laid out all the various ways. And I mean, it's vastly, vastly different. Not the least of which is that the enemies that you're fighting in Afghanistan largely have sanctuaries outside the country, obviously in Pakistan, either in Baluchistan in the case of the Afghan Taliban or in North Waziristan in the case of many of these other extremist groups. And it obviously makes it very, very difficult if the enemy's leaders are beyond your grasp, whereas in Iraq, we could go after what we term the irreconcilables with even greater intensity, again with 2-2 and Delta and SEAL Team 6 and so forth, while we then reached out to the mid-level leaders and below and literally sat down across the table from people who had our blood on their hands, as our brigade commanders quizzically asked, "Is this really what we're going to do?" By the way, this is why I went on my way to Iraq for the surge. I stopped in London, went to number 10, met with Tony Blair, who, during my period, I mean, he was just a tremendous, if you will, wartime prime minister, heavily engaged, and all the rest of that. And I know the emotions about this in the UK. But again, for a battlefield commander, it was a very special relationship. And he asked if I had any requests, and of course I did. The one that was most important to me was to continue the deputy commander who was in position at that time, an individual named Graham Lamb, who was more than a bit outspoken, a terrific guy. We'd actually chased war criminals in Bosnia when he was the director of special forces. We were fellow 2-star division commanders during the invasion of Iraq. He was the other one who would hold his hand up and say, "Excuse me, Ambassador Bremer, did I really get that right? You know, we've already fired the military, fired the Baathists, now we want to fire everybody else. How's that going to work out?" Now he was the deputy commander. He'd helped do the counterinsurgency field manual in the UK while I was doing it in the US. And what was key is that he had always told me about how he sat down across the table from Martin McGuinness's guys who had been swinging pipes at his lads in 2-2 just weeks earlier. And I said, I need that because when I propose this stuff, there's going to be a lot of my own leaders who are going to question my sanity and say I've been in Iraq in the hot sun of Iraq for far too long. And that proved to be very, very valuable. He and then also General Stan McChrystal, who was our counterterrorism task force commander, were really supportive, and that enabled us to convince because again, you know, leadership is not just about giving orders in the military. You've got to make sure that those orders are generally supported, and if they're not, you need to have a climate in which people can actually question you and remark that perhaps the emperor is not fully clothed on that particular day.
Which brings us on to politics, and sorry, I've just got this mental image of President Trump not being fully clothed. Sorry, I apologize. And what is going on in DC at the moment? If we could go back to you, David, for your assessment, and then I hope Sir Nick will be able to say how important this is to us that the Americans get things right internally.
Well, every now and then there's these wonderful, slightly quirky British words that are really useful, and one of those is barking. Look, we're in for a very, we've had a turbulent period. We're not the only ones, obviously, experiencing turbulence in our capital. In fact, our democracies are not the only two to be experienced. I mean, I think one of the challenges of our time, to bring it back to the biggest of the big ideas again, the rise of China as the most important development, and it's an extraordinary development. By the way, they've done something in 40 years that no other country ever did since Deng Xiaoping welcomed the world to China, and their economic development is just truly unprecedented. But what we have is what might be termed a return of history, because a lot of you will recall that famous article by Francis Fukuyama back in 1989 when he said that history is defined as a competition of ideas and so forth about how do you elect governance or how do you select governance, and then also how do you organize your economy. And so he posited this as a competition between the democratically elected governments of the West with free market economics against the Soviet-led, at that time, of course, the Communist Party governance and a command economy. And he predicted correctly, which is why it was so famous, that the latter would collapse of its own weight. Well, there's a new competition now. And on this side, it is now a meritocratic one-party system of China that has actually performed quite magnificently. You can have some issues about the rise of the Orwellian surveillance state and all these others that a lot of journalists are fond of noting. But again, it has done something no country has ever done in a 40-year period. And it has what might be termed a hyper-competitive free market economy, state capitalism, albeit with an ecosystem that has large state-owned enterprises. And against that, you have the Western democracies, many of which are experiencing a great deal of populism, your country, my country, and a number of others in this continent alone. And the economics of these are seeing some real strains as well, with inequality in wealth that in the U.S. has reached a 50-year high, and these other that have given rise to the kinds of grievances and concerns and so forth that, if you will, populist leaders can play on. And so I think it's really incumbent that, needless to say, that we get our act together, that there are leaders who will put forward what I think were the ideas that we literally have felt that we have, fought to defend, and the freedoms and so forth, so that there can be a good, healthy competition. And ideally, obviously, it's not just a competition, but a cooperation on a number of issues as well, given that the world is much smaller, and so many of the issues that we confront are really not just national issues, they are international issues.
Your thoughts on that, sir?
Yes, I think the great challenge for our generation is how we protect our free and open way of life and our democratic system. Mm-hmm. Because the character of warfare is changing, the character of politics is changing, and of course it's becoming more and more polarized. And the chances of finding consensus, which we're finding in this country at the moment, are really difficult. And it used to be relatively straightforward. It's left and right. It's now no longer that, because social media and all the other things associated with it are creating a very polarized debate. And our democracy has not yet worked out how it deals with that challenge. And I think for all of us, we need to reflect quite hard on that, because unless we can find sensible middle ground and all that means, we're going to head down some really quite difficult places. And of course, if you study history and you look back, as you obviously know better than most, that's the sort of thing we noticed at the beginning of the last century. And that century didn't pan out terribly well. So I just hope we don't have to have a rude shock to go back and recalibrate our democracy. I hope we can sort it out before there is a rude shock.
I think if you look, to come back to Washington again, because democracy is not disrupted throughout the United States. There are many states that are actually doing very well. People are working together in state capitals and all the rest of this. I think what has happened in Washington is that the center has been hollowed out because of a variety of peculiarities of our particular system. It used to be that you had Republicans, Rockefeller Republicans, if you will, Bloomberg, but this is why Bloomberg couldn't run But, you know, they were Republicans who were fiscally conservative, internationalists, but they were socially liberal. And you had those sort of in the center, and you had blue dog Democrats, they were called. These were Democrats who were tough on defense. And you had deal-making room. The problem is that our primary system, where you have to win the nomination before you can compete for the general election, that has become the most important election, actually. But the only people that vote in the primary are the activists. So with each successive primary election of a nominee, you get pulled further to the left if you're a Democrat and further to the right as a Republican. I mean, what many members of the House of Representatives in particular, but also a number of senators, including John McCain, I remember was very close to him, and I said, how's the election looking, Senator? And he said, well, I'm a little bit worried about getting primaried. In other words, someone would be to the right of him. And he was a reasonably conservative individual in Arizona. So that pulls them further and further and further. And then we have redrawn districts with a process called gerrymandering, which solidifies, you know, it's red, Republican becomes bright red, blue becomes bright blue. Both parties do this, by the way, whoever owns the state house. And so that pulls it even further. And that is one of the challenges in Washington, is that to compromise has become really a bit of a dirty word, to use that even, to suggest that you could actually sit down and cut a deal. And that's why we have been lurching along at certain times and literally shutting down government over issues as opposed to just resolving them and figuring out, you know, can everybody give a little so that everybody can get a lot?
I've got one more question before I throw it open to the audience. And that is, you've spoken in the past about the importance of the big idea, getting the big idea right. Is there, I'd like to ask both of you, what is the big idea for you? If there's a specific thing that you'd like to everybody here to take away,
Sure.
What would it be?
Well, and this harkens back to some stuff that I've done on strategic leadership. And, you know, in an organization, you typically have one or maybe you have two strategic leaders, co-CEOs, if you will, and some of them, as in KKR. That's a different level of leadership from all of the others. The commander in Iraq, that is a strategic leader. I mean, you are determining whether you're going to go left, right, whether you're going to live with the people or consolidate on big bases, whether you're going to reach out and reconcile or withdraw that. I mean, these are big decisions, and you've got to get the big ideas right. And the reason the surge succeeded was not because of the 25,000 additional Americans. It was because of the surge of ideas. We literally reversed everything we were doing about 180 degrees, and the conditions were such that I was actually confident that we could truly just flip the entire country as long as I could keep the U.S. Senate with me. We were 1 or 2 votes away from losing our funding, potentially. So you've got to get the big ideas right. If you don't, it doesn't matter how many extra troops, resources, everything else, you're building on an intellectually shifty foundation, and it won't work. So to come back, I mean, what is the biggest of the big idea? I think it probably comes back to this issue of the return of history with a vengeance. That again, we have to get the U.S.-China relationship right for the entire world, not just for our two countries. But then for our side of the equation, if you will, we've got to get democracy right again, and economics right, and all of the rest of this. And if we don't do that, then obviously our side of the competition is not going to go as well. We will not be as formidable. We won't be united. By the way, the rules-based international order is something I very much believe in, and I hope that it can be sustained at a time when, again, China certainly, but other countries are also putting the most stress and strain on that order since the end of the Cold War. Ironically, given that China prospered under that rules-based international order more than any other country, because they've done better than any country in history during the time that it's been around. So these, I think that's the biggest of the big ideas, all comes back to managing the rise of China, the U.S.-China relationship, and then, if you will, on our side of the ledger, getting democracy right.
And for the Chief of the Defence Staff, what's the big idea at the moment?
I mean, I'm sort of slightly with David. I mean, I think you've got to look at the major disruptions that are happening in the world at the moment, of which the transference of power from the west to the east is obviously the biggest one we observe. But whether it's artificial intelligence, technology more broadly, population migration, whether it's climate change, all of these challenges are global challenges that cannot be dealt with in nationalist stovepipes. We have to find a way, if we really worry about the future of the world, of connecting everybody's efforts together internationally through whatever system that may have to be in the future to be able to solve these problems as a collective entity.
Right, let me throw it open now to the audience. There are going to be marching microphones. Here's one. Can you give that to this gentleman here? And he'll ask the first question, and we'll keep your hand up if you want to be the second questioner, and somebody else can give you a microphone. Sir.
Two short, closely linked questions. Why did we go into Iraq when it was being ruled by Saddam Hussein? And secondly, I was at a small lunch once years ago with General J. Garner, and he was highly critical of his successor in sending the Ba'ath Party bureaucrats home and sending the army home with their weapons.
Well, David.
Let me start with that, because I was a division commander on the ground at the time, having done the fight to Baghdad. And one of the big ideas, if you will, that any commander and any policymaker should remember in such a situation is to ask a question. We had this on our operations center, on the wall, staring at us every time we thought about a new decision. And it asked, will this operation or policy take more bad guys off the street than it creates by its conduct? And clearly, firing the military without telling them what their future was. We needed to do some demobilization, disarmament, reintegration, the DDR tasks, but not leave them in limbo for 5 long weeks as the riots got worse and worse and worse until a number of us, I flew to Baghdad and told the individual responsible, I said, your policy is killing our troops. We have to tell them, you've just fired them and not told them how they're going to provide for their families. By the way, they all took their weapons home with them, and they're reasonably trained. So this is a huge challenge. It was hundreds of thousands of individuals whose incentive was to oppose the new Iraq rather than to support it. And the same was true of firing the Ba'ath Party, especially down to level 4, without having an agreed reconciliation. Again, you did need to do de-Baathification, but not without an agreed process where you can bring them back into society. Again, the people we most needed. We were trying to reestablish Mosul University up in the north where I ended up after the fight to Baghdad. This is a huge university, 30,000 students, 19 colleges. There were 120 Ba'ath level 4 professors and deans and all these. Now, we were proud to kill Uday and Qusay, the sons of Saddam in Mosul. They were level 1. You get down here, these were all Western educated. Almost all of them had degrees from either the US or the UK. I mean, some of them drank. I mean, what more would you want in a partner in Iraq? That is joking, of course, because we were not allowed to. But again, these were what we needed. They were the kind of secular individuals that were most important to us, and instead they're thrown on the ash heap of history, and again, their incentive is to oppose the new Iraq rather than to support it. A catastrophically bad decision.
Thanks. And the first part of the question, why did you go into Iraq in the first place?
There's one question that I will never answer, and I will be very upfront about that, and that is whether or not we should have invaded Iraq, and it is quite simply because no individual wrote more letters of condolence to America's mothers and fathers than I did. And I just think that's not a question for a soldier in that particular case.
Or a soldier in your particular case?
I absolutely agree.
Next question. The lady with the microphone.
Thank you so much, gentlemen, for the conversation this morning. Should Ukraine be fast-tracked into the NATO club?
You're the serving officer.
I think, of course, that the challenge is you've got to look at all of this from a Russian perspective, and I talked about Russia being the acute threat to us at the moment. And you do need to understand what Russia's critical interests are. And I think that if we moved precipitately to integrate all of Russia's near abroad and all of Russia's neighbours into NATO, or for that matter, the European Union, that might really upset Russia. So I think these things have to be done very carefully, in a very measured way and a very thoughtful way. And of course, a lot of it also depends upon what Ukraine wants. So I think the right approach at the moment is the approach that both ourselves and the United States are adopting, which is to develop and help build Ukraine's institutions so that Ukraine can become a genuinely democratic society and can then make its own choice, and that will take time.
Oh, I fully agree. And I was just in Ukraine a couple of months ago, and for the first time, I actually was up on the front lines, by the way, and in the Donbass. It is like World War I. I mean, it is trench warfare. People are still being killed on a weekly basis. It is a frozen conflict in terms of the front lines. It's a hot conflict in terms of the bullets that are flying back and forth. They deserve our support, I believe. I'm quite excited by the prospect of the new leadership that is there, both at the head of government and also the parliament. They have a mandate to combat corruption. I mean, this is how you have an individual who is basically a very successful TV comedian who wins, and I think has all the right big ideas for what it's worth. And so I'm actually quite hopeful about Ukraine, more so than at any time, I think, since the toppling of the Russian, essentially, puppet leader.
Next question.
Thank you. I was thinking you're talking about the wars of today and the wars of tomorrow. In both instances, I think the battle of ideas is important. How the consistency in the value in our values and the application of them, how important are they in the wars of today and the wars of tomorrow? I'm thinking in the week where Sisi has kind of clamped down on protest, British support for Saudi Arabia and what's going on in Yemen. We talk about people being excluded. Are we not fighting for our own values and our own ideas properly enough?
Well, look, I think, again, that we have seen a bit of a phenomenon really throughout the world where you have either autocrats or would-be autocrats, and they start out initially by going after the press, trying to undermine the rule of law. They weaken the institutions of state. They gather the reins of power in their own hands. I mean, this is what I was talking about. We've seen this in Eastern Europe. We have seen it certainly in North Africa. We've seen it in other parts of Asia and so forth. And it's a very worrisome phenomenon. And to see it in particular in countries that are part of NATO, for example, on the eastern flank and elsewhere, and again in Eastern Europe, I think is, again, very worrisome.
And I think there'll always be a dynamic, won't there, between values-based foreign policy and interest-based foreign policy. And the trick is to get the right balance between the two. But if you espouse the right values, you will have the right allies. And I think if you look at Russia and China, their challenge, of course, is who are their true allies? And for us, I think, as a body of countries who are connected through those ideas and those values, we are far more likely to prevail in the longer term. And that's what we've always fought for. And to my mind, that's what we should always fight for in the future.
Next question, that gentleman there.
Yeah, you've talked at length about Afghanistan and Iraq, and of course, Iran is in the middle, and you've quite rightly explained the interest that Iran has in both Afghanistan and Iraq, sometimes aligned with the West, sometimes not. So what are your thoughts about the call for military action that has come up many times, and of course in recent time, and the potential scenarios that you envisage?
Do you mean military action against Iran?
Yes.
Yes. I think one has to be very careful when what we're trying to do is to retain some form of stability in the Middle East and the Gulf area in particular. And I think if you look at the way in which US foreign policy has withdrawn the US from the so-called JCPOA, the agreement on the nuclear set of arrangements, that is something that our country doesn't agree with, and indeed most Europeans don't agree with it. And you have to, I think, work out really carefully what you feel the key interests are that you're trying to pursue. Now, I think for most people, we do not want to see a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. And it would be inevitable, I think, if Iran got a nuclear weapon, that others would want to follow. So that's got to be a very important objective. The second very important objective, I think, is that we must push back against some of Iran's more nefarious behavior. And what you see playing out in Syria, what you see with Lebanese Hezbollah, perhaps what you see happening in Yemen. These are all incidences and areas where I think we need to push back against that sort of destabilizing behavior. And then, of course, from a national perspective, we do have bilateral interests, and there are people who are still being held hostage in Iran. So we need to be really clear what we're trying to achieve here. And of course, what you've seen happen over the course of the last 3 or 4 months is in response to the so-called US maximum pressure campaign on Iran, you've seen Iran escalate along a very much an economic route. So what they've done in relation to tankers, what we've seen with the Aramco facility over the last 2 or 3 weeks, those are economic targets. People haven't lost their lives. So far, deterrence has stayed in place on all of the other lines of activity that you might have. And we need to recognize that in our response to Iran, because we cannot afford an escalation. But equally, we've got to get to a point where we find a way of preventing Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon and everybody else in the region following. So it's a very challenging set of circumstances, but the key thing to it is to make sure you're behaving in a proportional way and a way that doesn't achieve some form of escalation, which leads to inadvertent miscalculation.
David.
Well, look, I think we've been pretty effective. The U.S. has been pretty effective at putting Iran in a box. And I think it's not inaccurate to say that perhaps the U.S. has put itself in a bit of a box as well. And what we've got to do is help each other get out of these boxes, not only reestablish deterrence, but also reestablish incentives for Iran to continue to halt the path to nuclear weapons and so forth. I've said publicly that I would not have advised leaving the Iran nuclear deal. If your objective is to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, the deal was actually pretty good. Certainly, it ended the plutonium path to a bomb with cement in the reactor core. It eliminated the medium-enriched uranium 100%. It eliminated 99% of the low-enriched uranium, stopped half of the centrifuges from spinning, opened up all the facilities, including the deeply buried hardened one inside the mountain in Fordo, to inspectors. So there were some real virtues to this. Yes, there were some end dates, there were some sunset clauses. People have different views about how it would have gone after that based on the additional protocol, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But again, if that is the objective, then let's get back to the table and let's address what the perceived shortcomings of that are and figure out how we can get back to applying that, while also certainly not failing to recognize that this malign activity that's being carried out in the places that Nick said, but also in Iraq, by the way, where the Iranian-supported Shia militia have long been a massive thorn, not just in the side of the Brits in Basra and all the coalition throughout Iraq, but also now to Iraq in general. And it's one of the big challenges of what I think is the best Iraqi government, perhaps since the liberation of Iraq. The president, the prime minister, the speaker, all three are really exceptional individuals, but they're grappling with these issues as well. And again, by the way, we have to be cognizant of what we can cause there, because a lot of this will be indirect. If you notice what Iran has done in many cases, it's slightly ambiguous. It's not completely clear where it came from or who did it. Maybe we think we know, but it's not like you have 100% attribution and here's the launch point and there's still some debate about that, even in this latest case.
Tina Brown.
How dangerous is the end of secrecy, to the world? I mean, obviously we have WikiLeaks and Snowden, and then all of the leaked phone calls and Derek's leaked phone call and the latest thing with Ukraine. And I mean, it seems as if there is no such thing as secret communications anymore. And how do we deal with that in dealing with our world? And does it become a real threat?
Let's ask the former director of the CIA.
Well, yeah. Look, I think you almost have to act based on an assumption that if it doesn't become public right away, that it will over time. And again, you have to ask, how is this going to play not just on a battlefield or whatever, how does it play on the front page of the Washington Post? I have also publicly opposed enhanced interrogation techniques, and it's for several different reasons. One is I truly believe that it is wrong. Number two, I think it's ineffective if you really want information from a detainee and you have the time to do it. So I'm not talking about the ticking time bomb scenario where I might understand that depending on where the ticking time bomb is, that you might pull out all of the stops. But if you have a detainee for a period of time, the way you get information is simply by becoming the detainee's best friend with really skilled interrogators who know the culture, language, tribes, dialect, and everything else. But the other is that it inevitably is going to become public, and the price you're going to pay in the court of human opinion is going to greatly outweigh whatever benefits you may have gotten, arguably, from using enhanced interrogation techniques. So again, this is sort of part and parcel of that. You have to ask, how is this going to look when the sunshine is shown on it? And you might as well figure that out up front. Actually, when I was the director of the CIA, there was a case, which I won't get into, but there are sometimes what you might term a cover story. And something happened, we sort of put this thing out. It is reasonably plausible, but not quite. And I actually said, you know what, we are never going to do this again. We're either going to say no comment, or we're going to say this is what actually happened. But let's not go down that road again. I think that's a dangerous road down which to head. There is reason for covert action. There are reasons, and we still do. Certainly, there are plenty of secrets out there still, I can assure you. There are some capabilities that people actually don't know about and that haven't actually been in the latest spy movies, and it's good that they're not all out there. But inevitably, I think you have to just recognize that you're in a different day and age, and you're not operating in the shadows.
Yeah, I think it comes back to the fact the character of warfare is evolving so rapidly, and our opponents are using non-avowable, deniable tactics and capabilities against us, and we have to find a way perhaps of responding to that and indeed being able to do it ourselves. But I absolutely agree with David. One's got to make sure that the court of public opinion is able to judge you fairly at the end of all of this process. And I think on the battlefield, one has to accept that information is probably not going to be able to be kept secret. I think since WikiLeaks, we accept that it's going to be in the public domain, and everybody's looking in on you. So what you probably also have to do is to reinvent the lost art of deception, something that we didn't have to worry about for a long time, but I think we now need to think hard about it. And the recent D-Day celebrations reminded people of how it was used, and used hugely successfully. So I think it's a different environment. One just needs to think about how one's tactics and techniques are applied in what is a different environment.
That's a question for you, Richard Dearnoth, perhaps.
Sorry. Ladies and gentlemen, we've had the privilege of hearing the innermost thoughts of two of the most important and successful generals in the world today. So let's give them a round of applause.